Welcome to the Reconstruction Agenda. I'm Andy Craig. So at the heart of our constitutional system is Congress, the first branch, Article 1. We've spent a lot of time on here talking about the runaway presidency, the courts, executive overreach. But there's a flip side to that story that gets a much less attention, which is what happened to Congress itself. Not in terms of who controls the majority or how our electoral system works, but the workaday functioning of Congress as an institution. Is it capable of doing the things we need it to do? Congress is supposed to write the laws that govern a $7 trillion federal government, hundreds of agencies. It's supposed to oversee the executive branch, scrutinize the budget, set policy on everything from welfare programs to nuclear weapons. And to do all that, it relies on a workforce, committee staff, personal office staff, nonpartisan support agencies. And this has been shrinking for decades, even as the complexity and scale of the federal government has exploded. So the result is a legislature that increasingly can't write its own bills, can't evaluate the programs it funds, and can't check the executive branch without relying on the very lobbyists and interest groups it's supposed to be regulating. So to help us understand what's gone wrong and what it would take to fix it, happy to be joined today by Kevin Kosar. Kevin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies Congress and the administrative state. He's the co-editor of Congress Overwhelmed, The Decline in Congressional Capacity and the Prospects for Reform. He co-founded the Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group and also hosts the Understanding Congress podcast. Before all that, he spent more than a decade working at the Congressional Research Service, so he's seen the problem from the inside. Kevin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
So I think most people, even those who follow politics pretty closely, have a very incomplete picture of how Congress actually works on the inside. You know, they see the floor votes, they might see some C-SPAN clips, maybe a committee hearing. But like I was touching on, the actual day-to-day process of legislating, who's doing the research, who's writing the bills, who figures out whether the numbers work, that's mostly going on behind the scenes and doesn't have the cameras on it. So before we get into what's broken about all that and how to fix it, can you just walk us through what that process looks like when it is working? How is it supposed to work?
Sure. I'm probably dating myself a bit by referring to the old video Schoolhouse Rock. But if you haven't seen it, it's worth Googling. Schoolhouse Rock did a series of videos to improve civic education in America way back in the 70s. And one of them was on how a bill becomes a law. And this is the so-called regular order process, where a member introduces a bill. The bill is referred to the appropriate committee or committees. The committee will then look at the bill over, perhaps gather information, maybe hold a hearing, mark up the bill, report it out, at which point in time it can be put up for a vote in whichever chamber it's been introduced to. At that point in time, if you end up with a House bill and a Senate bill that are different, you would have a meeting called a conference committee where members of the House and members of the Senate get together and just bargain it out. And then ultimately they take that draft bill and that bill gets to go through both chambers again and off to the president. That's the classic version of how legislation should get made. It still happens these days, but there's a whole lot of what's called unorthodox lawmaking going on. This is lawmaking that doesn't really follow that pattern. So you may have a member introduce a bill. It could go to committee. It could sit there and die in committee. This member could then turn around and go to House or Senate leadership and say, hey, you got this big omnibus going through. Can we just slip it in there? It'll be buried amongst the 2,000 pages. Boom. Sometimes that works out. We used to have a process by which Congress would authorize government to do stuff in authorizing laws, and then they would separately appropriate money towards those authorized purposes. More and more, that process is kind of blurring. We have lots of agencies and programs that are no longer authorized, but nonetheless, there's money being appropriated towards them. So everything has gotten very messy on Capitol Hill.
So part of that is that, individual members of Congress are not generally policy experts. A senator on the Armed Services Committee might be a former prosecutor or small business owner or something. They don't have a background in defense procurement. They also generally will sit on 3 or 4 committees covering totally different subject areas. So, in practice, how much of that substantive policy making work is really being done by staff? And just kind of for context, how many people does a typical member of the House or member of the Senate actually have working for them? And how does that compare to kind of the breadth of what they have to do?
Most of the legislative work is done with heavy reliance on staff. It is just not the case that you have a member of Congress sitting in their office, kind of writing out, "Hey, I'm going to have a bill. I'm going to amend the current K through 12 education policies by doing this, that, or the other." No, they rely heavily on staff to do these things. The staff themselves reach out to the Congressional Research Service. They may rely on GAO. If it has clear budgetary impact, they might contact the Congressional Budget Office. There are also a core of lawyers inside the House, the counsel's office, who inevitably are doing the work to turn rough text into something that can actually be introduced or move through the chamber. So it's definitely a group effort. But yeah, I mean, congressional staffing, unfortunately, has declined since the 1980s. There are just fewer staff on Capitol Hill, particularly in the House of Representatives. The average member of the House has only 18 people. And seeing as the average member represents about 740,000 voters, that's a mismatch. And that number is only getting further and further out of kilter over time as the US population grows, but also, unfortunately, as the size of the executive branch grows. There's this problem of aggregation where over the last 100 plus years, the executive branch has gone from something that was manageable in size to something that is utterly unmanageable. It's a gigantic conglomerate with hundreds and hundreds of agencies and thousands upon thousands of programs. And Congress has just kind of built this beast inadvertently over time into a colossus. And that colossus is very difficult to control.
So that kind of gets to the problem, which is, like you mentioned, this has been going back at least to the 80s and the 90s, that Congress has hollowed out its own capacity to do that work. And it's striking the kind of paradoxical quality of that. We have this image of the Madisonian scheme, that their own ambition will kind of motivate them to protect their own power, to defend the institution. But this is something different than the story of how Congress has kind of lost power to the executive branch through court decisions or presidents overreaching, grabbing new powers. Uh, Congress has done this to itself. Congress controls its own budget, its own staffing levels. In the grand scheme of the massive federal budget, we're not talking about, it's not like this is busting the budget in order to have congressional staff. I mean, this is a tiny fraction. So why has Congress chosen to starve itself, and how has that played out?
Well, Congress has plenty of incentives to grow the executive branch. Members roll into town, freshly arrived with all sorts of ideas about how they can do stuff with government to make things better. We also have an enormous number of interest groups in this town. Throw a rock and you're going to hit some lobby or some group who's pushing government to either do more or hoping that government is not going to cut back a program or programs that they like. So there's kind of these natural forces that make the executive branch get bigger, that incentivize legislators to shovel more money there to create more programs. Those same incentives are not really at play when it comes to legislative branch spending. And members of Congress also are exceedingly afraid of being attacked for spending more on themselves. There's this sort of populist element out there that thinks, Congress should be a hair shirt. You as a human being in this country should sign up to go work in Congress, and you should have low wages, you should have very few staff, and you should just be good, earnest people who do the right thing, and we don't want any of this big spending. That conception of what a legislator is goes back to the earliest years of this country. And I can appreciate the desire is there, but it's really at odds with just the practical reality here. And so Congress, it perpetually starves itself. There's also an asymmetric party aspect to this. Democrats tend to be happy to spend money on most things, and they are happy to spend more money on the legislative branch. GOP, not so much. They are regularly against it or outright fearful of doing it.
And that touches on something, I've encountered coming from kind of a smaller government intellectual space, is that if that's one of your commitments, I think a lot of people confused about this, because if you want smaller government in general, the idea that we need more congressional staff, more congressional capacity can get kind of conflated. So what would be the case if you're coming from, right of center, if you want generally smaller government, balanced budgets, rein in the bureaucracy, all that kind of stuff? Why does improving and increasing how many people are working on the Hill actually serve that, or at least is not bad for it?
I tell my many libertarian friends that you've got a tough choice to make. I know in your ideal world, we would pass laws that simply just shrink the executive branch way down. Doing that's really hard. Again, there are a lot of natural forces out there, interest groups and the like, that push back on that sort of thing. Voters often fall in love with government programs. They don't want to pay for them, but they fall in love with them. So doing that is hard. Okay, if we accept that fact, if we accept the fact that we've got a large executive branch, do we want it doing most of the policy making when it is in fact not directly accountable to voters? Or would you rather have more of the policy making being done by Congress, whom you can, walk through the front door and go talk to their staff? Which one is going to be more accountable to the average voter? Take your pick. The administrative state over here, or those silly people on Capitol Hill? You may say it's a Hobson's choice, but I think you want to put your chips on Capitol Hill. There you have a real voice.
So on the kind of practical level, one of the things that I hear a lot, I'm in DC, I've worked on policy stuff, I have friends that work on the Hill, is that they are simply underpaid. If you're talking about kind of a legislative correspondent, they might start at $45,000, and DC is not a cheap place to live. And, meanwhile, you talk about the lobbying firms down the street. There's K Street that'll offer them two or three times. And so you kind of get this immense turnover of people coming in to do a few years in their 20s and then cashing out effectively to go do lobbying work, or, sometimes they'll go to a think tank or other options like that. But it is hard if you go to a voter and say, we need to pay congressional staffers on Capitol Hill more. People do have, exactly as you're saying, that kind of populist instinct that, we don't want them they're already too coddled, they're too powerful, they get too much money. I think people don't understand that the people doing this work are often struggling to get, they're sharing apartments, they're not able to afford a car, things like that. And I think part of this is also that there's been an issue that it's tied to congressional pay for the members. And, nobody wants to go campaign on, I increased my own pay, but it's hard to have staffers who are paid more than you. And so that gets awkward. How do we go about kind of just improving the payroll situation, the retention situation? Just like if you were running a business and you had this kind of turnover problem where you weren't able to retain people.
You know, this is an argument I've been making for some years, which is when you think of Congress, try to think of it as like any other organization. If you want it to be successful, it needs to have the right people. It needs to have good technology. It has to have good internal processes that focus on producing outputs, good internal structures, et cetera, et cetera. Think about the human resources aspect of it and ask yourself, do you think, seeing as staff do most of the work on Capitol Hill, that it is a good situation that the average staffer who's helping write these laws is 26 years old and more than likely got to Congress because they were an activist who helped a person get elected? They were out there in the person's home state handing out leaflets or doing other sort of stuff. Does that set Congress up to work well? And it is a great idea if the average staffer works there for 4 years or so and then quits, meaning you have to bring in some brand new fresh face to learn this job from scratch. Obviously not. If you're running a business something other than an ice cream stand, something that requires a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge, balancing a lot of variables, an unpredictable schedule, to say nothing of having to do with all sorts of geopolitical stuff like, oh, I don't know, a war with Iran. You'd probably want people who are a little more seasoned and a little more qualified for it. And guess what? You're not going to get those if you're paying people crummy money. Washington, D.C. here, if you want to get a studio apartment, even on the outskirts of the city, you're going to pay north of $2,000 for that. It's expensive. If you want people to stay here and ultimately start families, like, you're not going to do that on $38,000 a year unless you are a trust fund baby. So, yeah, if you want to have a well-resourced Congress that has a chance at being competent, you've got to have well-paid staff.
So I wanted to zoom in on kind of where your experience in particular was with CRS, the Congressional Research Service. Now, this isn't one that probably has a lot of public awareness. It's not something people talk about a lot, but as a policy guy, I find CRS reports are just immensely valuable because they do things nobody else does. If you've got a question, CRS has got an answer about some obscure precedent. How has this law been interpreted? Here's the legislative history of this procedure. And there's really nothing else quite like it, even in the private sector kind of think tank world, nonprofits. So from your kind of, when you were there, what's happened to CRS from the inside? Has it been shrinking? Has it been losing capacity? And then what does that mean for members of Congress trying to do informed policymaking?
Well, yeah, the trend lines are not particularly good for the Congressional Research Service. Specifically, if you looked at just the raw number of employees back in the 80s, they had 900. Now they have a little over 600. Admittedly, some of those 900 people back then were typists. You don't really need those anymore. But nonetheless, the size has not kept up. It's declined. And, again, the scope of government has gotten bigger. There are more things to study and keep track of. That's just a fact of what's happened over the last 40 years. So that's a real problem. It's also the case with the rise of the kind of hyper-partisan competition between Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill. It's created an environment where CRS wonks are anxious. Their pay comes through an annual appropriation that's passed by the House and the Senate. And none of them get paid if that appropriation doesn't happen, or if Congress gets mad at the agency for bringing inconvenient facts out in their reports. So this hyper-partisan environment where each, Dems and Republicans are trying to control the narrative, and they don't want any alternate facts out there. It makes it really tough on CRS to do their job. It's been an unfortunate thing that, when I was at the agency, you could see between 2003 and 2014, as the internet and hyperpartisanship ticked up, the writing in the reports became more tepid because it was all about, like, just don't make anybody mad on Capitol Hill. Do a lot of, on the one hand, this, on the one hand, that. Proponents say, critics say, which kind of dilutes the product because ultimately CRS's value add is expertise, and expertise is not neutral. If you take a simple topic, like does gravity exist, like you don't want to cite somebody who says, no, it's fake. But that's the sort of pressure that an analyst at CRS feels, unfortunately.
So in addition to CRS, there are a few other agencies. I just wanted to kind of run through them and what they do. So there's GAO. There was one that no longer exists, the Office of Technology Assessment that you've written about that was done away with in the 90s. And then there's some others that kind of, CRS is sort of the research arm, the in-house think tank. What are these others up to?
Yeah, so Congressional Research Service, it is Congress's in-house think tank. It produces reports and legal analyses on just about every topic under the sun. They also provide trainings to legislators and the staff, like how do you introduce a bill? How does the budget process work, etc. CRS staff are available for helping committees when they want to prepare for a hearing, doing research support, identifying good witnesses. The CRS is kind of an all-purpose utility tool for the legislature. Government Accountability Office, they also, a bit like CRS, have been around more than a century. They are the people who, for the most part, follow the money. They used to be known as the General Accounting Office. They're now the Government Accountability Office, but they're the folks who go in and audit agencies. They tell you where the money is being spent. They'll tell you if the money is being misused. They also do program analyses. They do consider bid protests if some private sector company thinks that they got screwed in the course of the awarding of a contract. So GAO does a lot of important stuff. Congressional Budget Office, they were created in 1974. They directly advise Congress on budget. They supply the numbers on what's going on, the economic assumptions, all that sort of stuff, so that Congress can use real numbers or something close to real numbers in their budgeting. Other than that, yeah, you mentioned the Office of Technology Assessment, which was a early 70s creation, and its job was to take a long view of technological developments, everything from medical testing to space travel, I mean, all that sort of stuff, and to produce these kind of over the horizon reports about like where this might all be leading. And yes, unfortunately, in 1994, the Republican led Congress defunded the agency, which was right at the cusp of the eruption of the World Wide Web. Most unfortunate. Otherwise, we have one other legislative branch support agency, which is the Library of Congress. They have a law library. They also provide subject area support for members and staff who request it.
And what one aspect of this is the committee system, which I think is another thing that's kind of inscrutable to general public. When something gets to the floor, that's almost not quite the complete end of the process, but that's at the tail end of the process. So, you have all these committees, you'll have the budget committee, armed services, oversight, all the rest of them. What does their capacity look like? Because we have these hearings where it's kind of just the soundbite competition for the cameras. Everyone gets their 2 minutes or whatever it is to speak, and they'll have witnesses and stuff. But are the committee staff, are they helping individual members know like what's worth asking about? What would be a substantive question? Are they, what's the division of labor kind of there between committee staff and a member's individual office staff?
Yeah. So if you were watching a hearing, the vast majority of the work that was done to produce that hearing was done by the committee staff. They're the ones who work through picking out witnesses. They pick the subject matter. They screen the people who may come in and serve as witnesses. They're requesting information ahead of time so that they can write briefing memos for legislators who will be sitting up on the dais and asking the questions. They frequently write the questions themselves. If you watch C-SPAN, you will see sometimes legislators up on the dais who are being handed papers by somebody behind them. And they sit down there and they kind of look and they say, well, my first question is, and then they look down and read the question that was handed to them. So yeah, it's a little bit like the relationship you would see if you were looking at a C-suite office of some corporation, a citizen, you've got the CEO or some high executive, and you've got the support people who are basically queuing him in on the specifics of the issue. So the staff there are absolutely essential. And unfortunately, the staffing in the Senate has gone up a bit since the 80s, but it's not clear to me that it's sufficient. Meanwhile, in the House, the staff level has gone down. And one of the kind of underappreciated things is that when you're talking about staff, you can kind of put them into two buckets, committee staff. There are those who are professional staff. These are the ones who are not assumed to be partisans. Yes, they do have partisan affiliation, but the idea is like we need these people on committees who stay there for a long time, who are not getting fired just because Democrats took over the chamber or Republicans took over the chamber and swapped out the chair. Then there's the political ones. And unfortunately, the House in particular has just a habit of having way more political types serving as staff on committees than professional types. And this is not to say long-serving political staff can't be professional. Many of them are. They're super smart. But just the nature of it takes the whole red shirts versus blue shirts competition and brings it to the committee level in a way that I feel is a bit more intense than it needs to be. I think there can be a lot more collaborative committee work. So yeah, that's the nature of the beast with committees. Some will run better than others. They really are like little businesses unto themselves. And if you have a competent chair who knows how to create a collegial environment, you're going to have a committee that has a better chance at being successful.
So in terms of going forward, that there has been kind of, I think, a sense, and we've talked about this a lot, that there is an escalating crisis of Article 1, congressional functioning. And obviously that a lot of that has to do with dealing with the administration, the executive branch, particularly this administration. So how do you make the case to voters or to members of Congress? I mean, to a degree, it's the case that maybe voters aren't even paying much attention to this. So you're kind of trying to just get to the members of Congress and make the case to them. So how do you frame that in a way that's palatable? And then what are the specific reforms that you would do? I mean, obviously we need to kind of just in a general sense increase the capacity. But if you had a legislative wish list, if you were writing the bill, what would you have in it?
Yeah, well, the first great challenge is to help lawmakers understand that the Constitution wants them to be lawmakers and that they are a separate branch from the presidency and that they are the final word on what the law means, that they shouldn't simply defer to the Supreme Court or the federal courts, defer to the president to figure these things out. Moreover, they should not behave as if they're a member of a European parliament where, oh, okay, I'm a Republican and we have a majority in the House and we have a Republican president. Therefore, I shall do whatever the executive wants and line up. He shall state whatever our priorities are and we'll just start lining up legislation to do what he wants. Like, that's a whole mindset. And it's a new mindset in American politics. It's one I think we probably saw most intensely first during the Franklin Roosevelt years, when you had massive Democratic majorities in both chambers, and there was this crisis, Great Depression and World War II, where legislators kind of lined up behind the executive. And the executive branch got bigger and the executive power grew bigger. And that's the dynamic. So there's the mindset thing that you first have to break through. And then you just tell them, look, if you want to be successful at this, think about what you need. Do you really have enough staff? Do you have the staff you need? How about the IT? How's that going down there? The answer is not good. How about the way we structure committees and what they do? Do you guys really want to sit up on a dais and do these 3-minute speeches and then listen to expert witnesses for only 3 minutes? Like, is that the smartest way to learn something? No, there are other models. Like, just ask yourself, guys, what do you want to achieve and what are you going to have to put in place to do that? And there are so many things you can fix down there. I mean, really, throw a rock and you're going to hit something that's outdated or broken.
Well, I think that's all very good, and thanks for joining us here. So for folks looking to learn more about this, where can they find your work, and what are some good ways to get informed about this?
Sure. Take a look at understandingcongress.org. That's a nonpartisan website that we have created with just all sorts of useful information on it, data. It also houses the podcast, Understanding Congress podcast, where each episode talk to an expert about some niche aspect of Congress and what's working and what's not working. Or you can also find me out there on x.com, Blue Sky, and of course, Substack.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Kevin. And we're looking forward to getting the word out there about this, because I do think it's important that when we're talking about the Reconstruction agenda, as we're discussing here, making Congress work better is so essential to all the other things that we need to fix. We can't rein in the presidency. We can't reform the court system. We can't get better lawmaking unless we have a Congress that works. So this is all very important.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Zooming In, a project of The Unpopulist. To get all of the updates from our new series, Executive Watch, make sure to subscribe for free at theunpopulist.net. Until next time.